Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to address the 529 savings plan that's in the federal conformity provision of the tax bill. And just a little bit of background, the 529 savings plan, they were originally designed to serve as a tax incentive to save for higher education expenses. And in 2018, the federal tax reform opened the 529 savings plans by allowing tax-free earnings and tax-free withdrawals to be used for K-12 tuition to private schools. It's rather interesting and kind of a item of historical significance that the tax reform, this tax reform was authored by Senator Tax Cruz from Texas. Texas is a state that has no income tax, but as you'll hear, this does have a negative effect on income taxes in other states. And the provision barely passed on a midnight tie-breaking vote by Vice President Mike Pence. So obviously there was a lack of consensus for this bill coming out of Washington. The changes to the 529 savings plan provide a new opportunity for people to avoid state income tax. This is nothing more than a tax break for the wealthy and has a significant effect on state tax revenue. So let me review the 529 tax provisions in the federal tax code. First, annual contributions are limited to $15,000 for single taxpayers and $30,000 for married filing jointly. However, over time, 529 accounts can amount to several thousand dollars. There is a limit to withdrawing $10,000 annually per student per account, and tax filers can also make 5-year contributions ahead of time, allowing the interest not only to be tax-free, but to be compounded. The longer the money is held in the 529 account, the greater the benefit. This 5-year one-time contribution is limited to $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for couples filing jointly. The average person or family certainly does not have the amount of disposable discretionary income available, and this provision is an obvious benefit to those in higher income brackets. 529 funds serve as a tax shelter for the wealthy to be used for E-12 expenses, allowing for earlier tax incentives resulting in greater tax benefit and greater loss over time to state tax revenues. There is no language in the bill other to conform to the federal tax code. So some questions would be, there are no investor income limits. Individuals can invest in multiple plans. There is no cap on the dollar amount to be invested in 529 plans, and there are no requirements for how long funds must be deposited before withdrawn. Well, Minnesota is one of 33 states that have either a tax credit deduction or a tax deduction to encourage 529 savings plans. The federal expansion to allow 529 plans to be used for K-12 expenses allows private school families to funnel their tuition payments into 529 plans to avoid state taxes. So let's look how this would affect Minnesota taxes. A Minnesota family filing jointly have $100,000 in taxable income. They spend $10,000 each on 2 children for private high school tuition and open a 529 savings plan for each child. The Congress 529 expansion opens Minnesota's $10,000 state income tax deduction for contributions to private school tuition for each child. The family could open a 529 savings account, briefly park $20,000 for private school tuition, and avoid over $500 in state income taxes. In this example, the family reduces Minnesota tax revenue by over $500, and this can go on for several years. And there are approximately 76,000 Minnesota students attending private schools, and with an estimated reduction in state taxes of more than 1.7 million, growing to over 2 million by the year 2022-23. Another important aspect of the 2018 federal tax reform is that Congress nullified the authority of the Minnesota legislature by providing tax breaks for private school parents that are paid for by reducing the Minnesota state tax base that pays for, in part, public schools. Minnesota did not choose to create tax-free private school tuitions. Congress superseded our state sovereignty and that sovereignty of other states. Expanding 529 plans to deliver state deductions to private school families will erode the tax base that funds public schools. We are spending intended public tax dollars on private schools. The Minnesota Constitution reads, "In no case shall any public money or property be appropriated or used for the support of schools where the doctrines, creeds, or tenets of any particular Christian or other religious sect are promulgated or taught." That's the Minnesota Constitution, Article 13. And there was a time in Minnesota that there was a tax credit for non-public school tuition. It was in effect from 1971 to 1973. And the tax credit was found to be unconstitutional by the Minnesota Supreme Court. So with that, Mr. President, I offer the A4 amendment. Thank you, Mr. President. The amendment adds back as income the amount withdrawn from 529 accounts used for public, private, or religious K-12 education, in effect holding Minnesota harmless to the federal 529 tax deduction. And Mr. President, I request a roll call vote.